Thank you so much for joining us for this fantastic panel discussion that we're having as part of Financial Inclusion Week. Welcome, everyone. And we have three fantastic panelists that we are waiting to introduce you to. But before we start the discussion today, let me acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So, the Asia Pacific Financial Wellness Initiative is a tiny charity run by volunteers, including myself and our lovely host for today, Anna Perera-Shaw. We are so excited about this topic. This is a new and fresh way to think about financial inclusion, because what we're going to talk about today is the opportunities for young people, particularly those on lower incomes, to have access to a sustainable and electric car, which is a luxury that many of us haven't been able to think of before, but now is being made a reality due to the work of these three fantastic panelists. And without much further ado, let me hand over to you, Anna, to introduce our panelists.
Great, thank you, Vinita. And this is a really good chance to talk about something a little bit different, and it's an area that RFI actually has some research on auto finance and electric vehicles in particular. And I can say that we have been having some conversations about this particularly the last couple of years, where it's become more at the forefront of consumers' mind, the opportunity to buy electric vehicles, and just seeing more demand, but also more stock, more availabilities of these cars. And I like the topic today, where we're weaving in financial wellness as part of this and thinking about the sustainability view that comes as part of this. So in terms of who is on this great panel discussion today, we have three panelists. So we have Joel Larsen, who is the General Manager of Personal Lending at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. We've got Behyad Jafari, who is the CEO of the Electric Vehicle Council of Australia, and Charlie Richardson, who is the Head of Strategy at Vyro. So got a good mix of perspectives and experience here, and I think there'll be a great chance to bounce some ideas and have a good discussion. And I think to start us off, I'll hand over to each of my panelists to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail. So a bit more about their roles and their organisation and the work they're doing in this space. And then I've got some questions to take us through to form our discussion today. So Joel, I might start with you, and then we'll go ahead to our other panelists as well.
Sure, thanks Anna. Hi everyone, Joel Larsen here, as Anna mentioned, General Manager of Personal Lending at Commonwealth Bank, Australia's largest provider of financial services to individual customers, and in particular we lead a large personal lending business. We're seeing more and more of our customers choose electric vehicles as their preferred mode of transport and as a thing that they want us to finance more. We're really passionate about helping customers connect with affordable, sustainable options. We've recently launched an electric vehicle loan or green loan product, which is a discounted finance offering for customers that are looking to buy an EV. And we see a role for the bank to play take a leadership position here in helping connect customers to a good deal on an EV, but also providing them with all the right information and good deal on finance at the same time. Ultimately, with the goal of helping to save them money with their outgoing repayments. Thanks, Anna.
Hi, my name is Behyad Jafari. I'm the CEO of the Electric Vehicle Council of Australia. The Electric Vehicle Council is an industry association representing companies across the electric vehicle sector here, with the mission of both accelerating Australia's transition to zero emissions transports and also to help build a sustainable industry with companies participating with electric vehicles. The way that we do that is by helping to establish an ecosystem, whether that's through things like charging infrastructure, model choice, the variety of options that people can choose to access or buy a vehicle, whether through finance, subscriptions, other things, really to help make zero emissions transport the obvious choice for Australian consumers. So rather than needing to take any special efforts, in an ideal situation, when somebody wakes up and decides they need to buy a car today, the easy and obvious answer for them is to buy a zero emissions vehicle. Looking forward to the discussion today.
I'm Charlie Richardson. I'm the head of strategy and an advisor to Vyro. Vyro is an Australian entity retailer that focuses on sale of new and used EVs, purchasing new and used EVs, leasing and also renting as well. So the only entity in Australia that actually does all four of those things within the EV space. Vyro's mission is to put EVs within reach of everyone, and that's all Australians. They've largely been the domain of the affluent, and we're working hard to make sure that they're accessible to everyone else. We do that in a lot of different ways, which I won't necessarily go into here, but we are a brand agnostic platform. So we're all about finding out, one, whether an EV is right for you, and then two, which EV is right for you. And on top of that, we've also built out our own EV-specific SaaS platform, which actually supports the sale of EVs, not just here in Australia, but internationally as well, for other manufacturers and other retailers. For me personally, been involved with EVs for 25 years. I was building them in uni. They've always been just over the horizon. It's nice to see that we're actually cresting the horizon and seeing EVs on the street en masse, and they're coming with a vengeance.
And I guess thanks for that intro. And I think if we start the discussion with, I guess thinking about the current landscape that we're in, you mentioned you've been looking at EVs for a number of years now. Are there any key changes you've seen? If we just think about the current landscape, anything you've noticed in that period of time?
Well, I'll jump in just from a technology standpoint. I mean, the simple thing is battery prices have dropped precipitously. So along with the same curve that we've seen for solar adoption in Australia, and there's been that exponential decline in the price, we're seeing that same thing now, and we're really still at the beginning of that from a battery perspective. And that's why you're seeing the prices drop so fast. We're also seeing scaled manufacturing. So obviously, batteries represent about 30% of the price of a vehicle, and when you see that that main component drop so precipitously, along with the fact that manufacturing is scaling up, you're getting the best of both worlds. The key element is dropping in price, and scale is obviously driving down the cost to manufacture.
Just to follow on from that, I think so. What that's resulted in is electric vehicle prices, particularly electric car prices, have come down. Alongside that, options have also increased. So for a car purchaser, price is certainly one important element, but so is suitability. Having electric cars available in different shapes and sizes in order to suit different people's needs has been a really important part of this. So whether that's small SUVs, hatchbacks, sedans, all of those different types of options that are popular, because people are ready to make sacrifices to what they need in order just to buy an electric vehicle, or at least the portion of people who are willing to make those sacrifices are far more limited than the target market for EVs. So what we've seen between those two, with prices coming down and ranges going up, is the type of people buying electric vehicles and the reasons why they're buying it has started to shift pretty dramatically. We've heard from a couple of people already talking about, I'd say once upon a time, EVs were much more for the affluent. That was true for a very long amount of time, and EV sales were pretty small as a result of that. As we have started in Australia, for instance, over the last 3 years, we've seen electric vehicle sales double every year. And that hasn't just been more and more rich people buying electric vehicles. That has been increasingly people from middle incomes, as well as from middle income suburbs and middle income families, finding that electric vehicles are the suitable choice for them.
Yeah, it's definitely moving out of that early adopter phase into a pure economic decision. People who are buying EVs because they are the right fit for purpose and the most economical choice for them.
And I guess that's a good point in terms of the customer base that is seeking out electric vehicles. And RFI data shows that they're, even in a 12-month period between our 2022 research and our 2021 research, we did see quite an increase in customers indicating they're planning to purchase a new or used electric vehicle. And I guess, Joel, from a CBA perspective, have you seen a difference, like mentioned, around the average kind of, what that customer looks like who is seeking out a loan for an electric vehicle? Or is it kind of different in the financing space when we're thinking about how customers are accessing these vehicles as well?
No, we definitely have seen a pretty rapid increase in demand. We see about 1 in 6 of the new vehicles we finance are actually for electric vehicles. And part of that's because we've got a differentiated proposition in EVs, but a big part of that is what the gentleman mentioned earlier around shifting customer dynamics. We definitely saw, the odd person finance the sort of early adopter Tesla pre what I'd call the mass adoption phase. We're now seeing just everyday Australians take us up on that offer. And the primary driver in that conversation has shifted from being about sustainability and potentially performance or brand association to one of affordability. To build on Charlie's point, but when you put an electric vehicle next to a combustion engine vehicle, it's generally more expensive. But when you help customers understand that they no longer have petrol costs, they have lower maintenance costs, and then they can access discounted finance, the week-to-week or month-to-month cost for a household or family that's budgeting becomes a lot lower. It becomes a much more sensible economic decision for them. And so that is really what's driving that growth in demand and I suppose lending from the Commonwealth Bank.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective around how customers view these types of cars based on the legacy of it being a certain kind of customer that potentially sought out an electric vehicle in the past. And I think with petrol prices being, they've really been quite high recently, especially now. But in the past 12 months or so in Australia, the prices have been increasing. And do you find it challenging to get customers to think about the overall cost, the end-to-end ownership cost, or is it just part of how you structure, the messaging, the marketing, how you explain the product? Because I imagine there's this cultural shift that almost needs to occur, in the future around getting customers thinking about not just, well, the vehicle itself will cost X amount, but it's actually, in 5 years, this is how much in total you'll be spending versus, this much with a petrol vehicle.
Yeah, that is one of the hurdles and one of the roles for the banks, for the industry, for the manufacturers, for firms like Vyro to play, is that education piece. But yeah, it is an initial struggle. I think with the sort of changing finance products, tools and things that help customers with making those decisions, that's becoming less of a barrier. And now we're sort of starting to find ourselves shifting to other barriers like, how long will it take me to get a vehicle? Where's my local charging infrastructure? Can I install charging in my house? And they're now starting to be more of the questions we're answering versus the original cost-based trade-off. It becomes more about the end-to-end car owner experience.
There's some of that value in having electric vehicle-specific products, because, of course, the other way of addressing this is just to allow electric vehicles to sit inside your existing car finance product range. But this is both you get two types of customers, one that comes saying, I want to buy an electric vehicle already, and what can you find that's suitable for me? And if you have an electric vehicle specific product, then great. They're like, well, you've made some particular effort, so excellent, I want to do business with you. But that other customer that's just looking for a car, providing them that touch point to say, actually, we do have an electric vehicle specific product, to them means, well, why not think about the electric vehicle? Why not think about, and that starts the conversation for them of, well, okay, how much would it be to install a charger? How much is the car? What type of options are available? And that allows them then to discover, yes, it is accessible to me, and yes, I can now very clearly see what the benefits of that are. And as we talk about moving more, further away from that audience of people who have already come locked and loaded wanting to buy an EV to just that general consumer who wants a car as a tool of trade or just to help them get around, providing them certainly lower cost finance, lower cost electric vehicles, more chargers, all of those are important, but making sure that they have that opportunity to actually think about it and not letting them get to a point where they've maybe already bought a petrol vehicle and half a year later considered, oh no, petrol prices have just skyrocketed. Why didn't I buy an electric vehicle 6 months? Why didn't I think of it back then?
Yeah. I think one of the other things. Oh, go ahead, Charlie.
So I would say one of the things that we've had thousands of these conversations with potential customers, right? Both from a retail standpoint, those that are potentially interested, and then even from a corporate standpoint, some of our clients who are mandating that their staff go electric. The really interesting thing is that the conversation between buying an ICE vehicle and buying an electric vehicle, even though they have the same utility to a customer, is very different. Buying an ICE vehicle, internal combustion engine, is about the features, the amenity, the price point, availability, right? When we start talking an EV, it inevitably turns to what's the range? What happens if the battery if the battery fails? How am I going to charge it, right? Those are very different conversations. And what we've really what we're working hard to do is to shift the consumer dialogue to one that is similar to their ICE conversation. We're finding a vehicle that is fit for purpose for you long before we get into that jargon about kilowatts and charge types and charge velocity and all those different things. Because honestly, those are things that consumers, we're now getting into a consumer base that generally does not have any interest in learning about that stuff. So how do we make the conversation as similar to what they're doing now and put those more detailed conversations much further down the track once we've established that an EV will fit the entirety of their needs, and that's a challenge for us. And it right now it often involves a lot of heavy lifting and live conversations, but we're getting there, and we're constantly refining that dialogue. So it's been really interesting for us, but we're really trying hard to shift people from focusing on those three elements, which to a large degree are resolved, but it's hard to do that without explaining in a lot of minute detail and jargon that, to be very frank, we're now getting to consumers that just don't have any interest in those things, right? They have an idea of what this vehicle should do for them and how it's propelled, and its fuel source is largely irrelevant to them. And it's about now, how will it do what it needs to do, and is it the most economically viable option for them? And sorry, Joel, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it makes perfect sense to me. I think the conversation around proving the value of an EV, if that becomes a more normalized conversation, you start looking at the traditional functions. The opposite is true for ICE vehicles, a combustion engine, particularly from a banking perspective, is the longevity of that. We offer a 7-year loan, for example, and I'm often thinking about, well, in 7 years, what kind of market would you be selling a combustion engine car to? Where will the petrol stations be located, et cetera, because that becomes a new risk factor. As this rate of growth expedites quite quickly, I would imagine in 7 years, or I hope that in 7 years, the majority of vehicles are electric, especially new ones. And then we've got to start thinking about, well, how do you help customers now understand that potential risk in the future as well?
It's an important risk factor. I mean, certainly from a bank and your balance sheet perspective, but also I think for the average household, the car's usually the second most expensive thing after the home that they buy. Yeah. And having that conversation with people about, when we say things like electric vehicle transition, what does that mean? That means that a market, you're going to buy a car today and in 5 or 7 years' time, the market is going to look drastically different. So if the second most expensive thing that you own suddenly exists in a market where you're trying to sell it, where people no longer want what you have, that is actually a pretty significant potential financial strain on you as well. And I think that's both, something both for businesses, but also as we speak to governments and industries, of making sure that at least consumers are aware of this risk, and that electric vehicles aren't considered just something cool and interesting, but that you do understand that this is becoming the new normal, and that means that the thing that you're buying today, maybe you still want to buy a petrol car after you know that, but certainly don't buy unaware that there is a potential that this thing may be coming.
I think the key thing you said there was the second most expensive thing. The interesting thing about that is it's the second most expensive thing that is a liability. It is not an asset like a house or anything else. All vehicles are like that. So it's already a liability. And to Behyad's point, is it a larger liability because it's right. Diesel or petrol powered?
Yeah, there's lots to consider there, but there's one thing I wanted to touch on was the concept of getting customers comfortable with the concept of having an electric vehicle, in their household. And we've spoken about some of the barriers, and that the topic there about some customers will hear everything about electric vehicles and still to choose petrol, which is completely fine. Though it's something that I hadn't considered with a 7-year loan, or thinking that quite far in the future to be thinking about what infrastructure is actually available for those customers who still have a petrol car. But something that I do hear a lot when we talk about electric vehicles is, in Australia, maybe this is fine in some European markets. Maybe this is, completely feasible that in 5 to 10 years, other markets could be completely electric. But in Australia, we've got quite a different geography. We've got big distances. What do you all think about that as a barrier? How would you respond to the argument that Australia itself is a unique geography that couldn't handle electric vehicles being the only kinds of vehicles we have compared to, say, other markets?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I can say about that is, one big thing that we have in common with every other market is that they all think that they're unique, and there are certainly, whether it's voices who are on purpose sort of advocate that because we're so unique, that means that we, unlike everybody else, need to be slower. That's something that exists. I think the much more normal and human side of this is just a new technology, and that carries with it a bit of sort of emotional anxiety. I often tell people when I bought an electric vehicle for the first time, I went on Google Maps and checked the distances of things and checked how many charges were available. And I knew absolutely that there was no logical reason why I was doing that. This is what I do for a living. I knew the data inside and out. I wrote the data. I knew it absolutely. But it wasn't a logical thing that I was doing. It was emotional. This is something expensive we were buying. I was a little bit worried. It was the first time that we were doing it. The thing that gives me absolute confidence about addressing those type of conversations is, when I started doing this work, I didn't come at it as a rev head or as a car guy. We sort of just looked at it at technological transitions. And what we're talking about was just as true for the internet or for elevators or for airplanes. Every time there is something new, people think that this is going to be, they are so set in their ways that there's going to be some drastic need for them to decide to change the way that they behave. But there isn't really an aha moment for the average consumer. It just it happens. They wake up one day and it's the new normal. Think about for the average consumer, however many decades ago, it's not like they chose, okay, I've decided I'm going to start using elevators from now on. They just sort of stepped into one. That's just how this works. So all of those other concerns that we have of maybe it's our geography, maybe it's about charging, maybe there are other things, we see it on a person by person level of, we often say that people worry most about, the range of their car or charging their car in the weeks before they buy an electric vehicle compared to after they do that. And it also happens on a national level. And the way that starts to be chipped away at it is you start to know more people who own an electric vehicle. And if people like you own one and it works for them, then you think, well, it must obviously work for me as well.
Some normalization, yeah. I'm going to say I wholly agree. We are a special market. We are wholly unique. And the reason why we're unique is not for why we should have a slower adoption, but why we should have a more rapid adoption. And that is the simple fact that the fuel that powers these vehicles is electrons. And every day we are awash in renewable energy, so much to the point that we actually curtail its generation. If you went to your local petrol station and between the hours of 10 and 2, petrol was free, or you were being paid to take it and fill up your car. That is exactly the world we live in right now. We have the highest penetration of solar in the world of 30% of roofs. We essentially have a free and abundant fuel source, or very, very low cost. And that is why we're a special market and why EV should be adopted even faster, not necessarily because of our geography and our driving habits that we don't necessarily fit.
And I would just add to that we don't manufacture a lot of vehicles, if any, of any type in Australia. So if the rest of the world moves on and Australia takes a unique position, we're very much going to be left with the cars that the rest of the world doesn't want to buy. And that becomes problematic for everyone. It's a problem for banks, it's a problem for drivers, motorists, and for the infrastructure. It's like buying a car that you can't have. There's no mechanic. There's no repair that you can go and get. If the world changes, how are we going to deal with that sort of legacy infrastructure? And I don't think those big global car brands are going to have an Australia-specific strategy. They're going to want to expand and expect that our market moves that way as well, I would hope.
I think importantly, yeah, please.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add that none of those comments doesn't mean that there are absolutely no challenges involved in something like a national transition to any new technology. Whether your workplace is rolling out a new operating system or your country is shifting from petrol to electric vehicles, there are certainly challenges. But I think the message there for consumers is that those challenges are actually normal. There are groups like us, and there are companies and governments and people who address those challenges every single day. So I think that's something interesting of, if you read something in the paper that tells you, well, there is a challenge associated with this, that doesn't mean that's a reason not to do something. Addressing challenges is what businesses do, right? So if there were no challenges, a lot of people me included, would be out of work.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I feel like even this conversation alone is just making me think about how this, how electric vehicles can really be marketed. And I really like this perspective that Australia is unique, but not just, oh wow, we've got such a vast landscape, but actually we've got, really intense sun and solar opportunity, and there's real scope on a positive side, but also the fact that we don't want necessarily the other markets dregs. We don't want all the vehicles no one else will take anymore because they've banned petrol cars, and we're stuck sort of behind with a quite expensive option that isn't sustainable as well. And we'll touch on, as I mentioned in the beginning, sustainability from kind of a cost of ownership perspective as well. But curious for our viewers, Joel, who are perhaps less familiar with CBA's lending offers and products. If a consumer was to seek out a car purchase, is it more affordable to get a loan for an electric vehicle compared to a petrol vehicle? Or what kind of product offerings do you have to kind of help with the accessibility and access of electric vehicles to Australians who are perhaps open, not necessarily against it, and maybe could be quite open to an electric vehicle purchase rather than a petrol purchase?
Yeah, good question. Right now, on a like-for-like basis, interest rates are cheaper for electric vehicles. A typical car loan sort of can start in a 7% range and go up to in the sort of 12, 13%. I know there's some are higher in other places. Our electric vehicle is currently priced at 5.49. So it's about 1.5% cheaper than the best rate you can get on a combustion vehicle. But what I know is that customers borrow quite a bit more because the cars are more expensive. But what I also can see is that we're getting the benefit of good borrowers, people who are making good credit decisions. The people who are doing the budgeting to buy an electric vehicle also happen to be really good credit, really creditworthy customers, and that's helping us, I suppose, stand behind that proposition for our customers. The overall consideration factor, there's the idea that you might spend a little bit more on the electric vehicle. Let's say that's 10 or 20% more than the ticket price of a similar model combustion vehicle in terms of specs. But actually, when we see that we're not factoring in weekly petrol costs, we're not factoring in a higher maintenance cost, etc., we just start to see that weekly amount significantly lower. And I think the example that we did with the Electric Vehicle Council recently showed that a Tesla 3 over our 7-year loan, we were saving the customer north of $4,500 over that effective life in all operating costs. And that makes a big difference for people who are thinking about that decision.
I think there's a big hurdle there for customers of people who've already been buying cars, been buying petrol and diesel cars, because first and foremost in their minds today are the sticker prices, the upfront price of vehicles. And the reason for that has been today, if you're comparing two different petrol vehicles, one might be more fuel efficient than the other, but the difference in the savings aren't that significant between one petrol car and the other. You might save $50 over a year or something, or a couple of $100 over a year. So really all you care about is that upfront price. That's where, when costs comes into it, that's the only thing that matters. With an electric vehicle, whether you're paying the same or paying more upfront, the difference is significant. So that first challenge, whether it's people like Commonwealth Bank and others, of allowing people to access the vehicle, because it does cost more, you actually have to have that money to buy something that does cost more. But to start thinking of that compared to a petrol vehicle in a pretty different way of, once I own this petrol car, I'll be spending something like $2,400 roughly. We did these calculations before petrol prices went up, some $2,000, $2,400 on petrol. That's going to get cut, into a fifth. It's going to get cut by about 80%. So what does that mean? How many years am I going to hold on to this vehicle for? What does that difference mean? And doing that calculation is tougher than just looking at a price on a sticker and saying that's how much this thing is going to cost me, right? But some of the motoring clubs did this work a few years ago that showed that people underestimated the operating costs of their petrol cars by about 80%. So because you're paying for petrol whenever, every week, whenever you happen to need it, not many people are sitting there calculating how much am I actually spending on this right throughout a year. When you do that, you realize actually there's a really huge cost component that comes after you buy the car.
Yeah.
Something that I thought of that we perhaps don't need to go into great detail, but just curious about, I mean, maybe we'll touch on that with the access when we think about a new demographic of customers. But I'm thinking about, a 17-year-old Australian who's looking to buy their first car, and they naturally go for the used car that's from 95. A lot of us probably had a first car that was basically as cheap as we could find and afford and would hopefully be safe. Do you think there'll be kind of a cultural shift where either customers buy cars later, or the used cars that are available, I guess, perhaps start phasing out of being petrol and start being more likely to at least be hybrid or electric? Do you have a vision of what the first car looks like for that red P plate, or the freshly licensed young person?
So if I can jump in here, so I think the used market. So over 50% of the vehicles sold in Australia every year are sold to fleet operators, right? And interestingly, the economics stack up enormously when you start talking about an EV in a fleet situation. So that in and of itself, over the next couple of years, we're going to see a release of that inventory, and it's going to be that low entry point, and we're already trying to do that with a lot of the used vehicles that we access and sell. The other part of this is that the new to market entrants, the BYDs of the world, and the other 10 OEMs who have announced, manufacturers that have announced they're coming to Australia in the next year or two, are all largely bringing a normal, what I would call kind of a mid-range of vehicles, but they're also bringing some very, very low end, or not low end, but low entry point vehicles. So similar to those small hatchbacks and those micros that you see now, that a lot of the P-platers that they're accessing, those are going to be available, and they're going to be available at a price point that is going to be accessible as a new or just gently used vehicle. So I think those two things are going to radically increase the amount of used inventory. So I don't think we're not on a decade-long slide here. We're on probably a 2 to 3 year slide where we start to see a massive influx of used inventory.
Yeah, I certainly don't remember caring about safety when I bought my first car. That's because I was invincible back then. But the reality, just following on from Charlie, is, the reality is, in Australia, some 75-80% of people only ever buy used cars. So all of the conversations we've been having about the people who can afford to buy electric cars and where prices are and all of those things are all about new cars. And when we talk about affordability, we talk about out of that 15-20% of, and when I say people, that includes half of those are to businesses. They include a pretty targeted population of people who are buying new cars in the first place, right? It's not for everyone. The reason why we care so much about what cars they buy is because there's only one way to get a second-hand car, and that's to sell a new car and wait a few years. So this is where, why it's so important that Australia doesn't fall behind or doesn't remain behind the rest of the world is because the longer it takes us to get more new electric vehicles in people's hands, the longer it takes 80% of the population to be able to access used vehicles, or, that P-plate. Obviously, we'll have to wait a few more years before it becomes your parents' hand-me-down vehicle or whatever else it might be. So that's why that urgency is so important. I said earlier, over the last 3 years, electric vehicle sales have doubled every year. That unfortunately today means that most of the electric vehicles on our roads are some 12 months old, right, or less than 12 months old. So that means that person in the 80% of the market who wants access to second-hand vehicles still has to wait a few more years for it to get there. And the slower we are to keep ramping up, the more people in the rest of that market will have to wait.
Something else that is on my mind from this discussion is, in a future where we have the majority of cars are electric vehicles, what happens to the petrol vehicles? Is there a sustainability lens there with how you dispose of or break down these petrol cars? Is that a really big question?
There is a conversion market, so and largely it's bespoke classics right now. It is moving a bit down market, so people being able to convert legacy petrol and diesel vehicles into EVs. Honestly, that's a great way to continue to sweat an asset that still has life left in it once you've taken out the propulsion. That's still pretty nascent. There are some really interesting things, essentially, motor and battery in a box, similar to a crated ICE engine that you might buy. So some of that's coming to market, but it's still pretty early days. I'd love to hear the other guy's perspective, but I mean, to me, there's already a scrap industry for vehicles, and there has been for the better part of a century. We've been taking vehicles as they age out, and they've largely been recycled to some degree, right? They go to scrap yards, they're turned into scrap metal eventually. They're componentized, and I would envisage that market is just going to grow, but the value of those legacy assets is going to decrease substantially, right? The market's going to have way more supply than it needs.
Yeah, personally, I'd be surprised if we saw conversions sort of grow much larger than a niche market, and by niche, both in things like classic vehicles and also things like mining vehicles, sort of certain fleet type of vehicles. Yes, you're right. There is a scrappage scheme in place for vehicles, because vehicles have been around for a very long time. The reality is, when we talk about sustainability in transport and the automotive sector, we used to say that it's more beneficial to buy the most efficient car that you can, and first efficient petrol car that you can, and hold on to it for as long as possible, because that sort of the power and the sort of cost of creating that new car has a greater impact than just being able to sweat one for longer. Now with the shift to electric vehicles, that's been disrupted, right? Of holding on to a petrol vehicle that remains a petrol vehicle for longer has a greater impact than actually starting to replace that fleet with electric vehicles. Because while electric vehicles do have that sort of sustainability impact from when they're first manufactured, they then start paying themselves back by being on the road. Whereas, yes, petrol vehicles also have a sustainability impact, but a lower one from manufacturing. Their greatest harm that they're doing is when they're being driven on the road. So holding on to them on the road for longer was the most detrimental thing that we could do. So in a bit of an adverse way, when we certainly we want to recycle the metals and all of those things as much as possible, but in that sort of reuse thing, it is really about making sure that we get to scrappage when we can.
And I think that then it becomes a situation of, if you imagine a car getting a 20-year life, like between when it's manufactured to when it ends up at the scrapyard, maybe it has 4 owners in between, maximum 20-year life. They might be longer, but the average car in Australia is 10 years now. So if we sort of said 20 is the end of life scenario, that means that for every brand new petrol car we're buying now, we've got to think about its next 20-year life cycle. And that gets a little bit scary, because then what you end up having is this sort of we could end up with this sort of 2-speed thing where most of the country's infrastructure is supporting electric vehicles. And then there's this sort of more niche requirement to support combustion engine. It's a little bit like Australia going, becoming a digital payments society, where you've still got cash that's accepted in some small places. It becomes the exception, not the norm, quite quickly. And so we need to think about that, especially when people are making the decisions now around what their next car is going to be.
Yeah, it's that proverbial ICE death spiral, right? The petrol and diesel prices just continue to escalate, and the cost of operating and sweating that vehicle just grow, and they become exponential because there's just so few on the road.
Yeah, there's quite often why, particularly when we look at policies, whether that's the way companies address electric vehicles, certainly when governments address electric vehicles, we really try to push away from this narrative of electric vehicles being purchased by more affluent people, because the perverse outcome of that thinking is that you start to design programs around more affluent people. And so you start to think, well, these are people who can afford the vehicles, therefore, whether it's things that we've seen in Australia, we can remove the rebates because they're people who can afford electric vehicles. Well, very directly, guess what happens? The people who can afford them keep buying them. The people who couldn't afford them suddenly becomes a bit more expensive, and it comes a bit further out of reach. But also in some of these things that we're talking about of the person most at risk of, if they purchased a petrol vehicle and in whatever it is, 10 years time from now or anything else, they're trying to sell that vehicle, or they're looking for refueling, or they're looking for servicing, the more affluent person can probably write that off. And it's annoying, it's a headache, but somebody who, this is the second most expensive asset and is a huge part of their family budget, they're the people who are most at risk and most vulnerable in this transition. And where it sort of comes back to that, not treating this as something for affluent, of if we haven't been providing that person with the education, with sort of that understanding of where the market's heading and what that'll mean, because we think, well, it's not really for them anyway, it's for wealthier people, then we are in 10 years' time going to be looking at some of these examples of people who are already in vulnerable situations also now having this asset that they either can't use, or it costs a lot more to use, or can't dispose of.
On the topic of increasing access, I think it's a really interesting point to think about which customer base is being targeted, because if you can't afford an electric vehicle, you keep buying a petrol vehicle, and it doesn't really help us longer term if there's only a select group of the population who can afford and desire to buy electric vehicles. Charlie, I'd be interested from a Vyro perspective, what you're doing in terms of the platform and addressing barriers, and just sort of how your work is working to increase that access and utilization, because I presume there's a bit of kind of what we've been discussing where you wouldn't just be targeting the affluent. I'm sure there's a strategy there. So can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I think if I was going to put a headline on it, right, our mantra is EVs have utility beyond mobility. You're talking about an ICE vehicle. It has one purpose, and that's from getting you from point A to point B. EVs represent a whole new set of value pools that are beyond mobility. Right, you're talking about the peer-to-peer space. You're talking about vehicle to X, vehicle to home, vehicle to grid, vehicle to vehicle, and you're also talking about that battery life cycle, right? So interestingly, when EVs reach end of life, their battery is not done, right? So it still has a lot of inherent value. What we're really thinking about is, how do we access those value pools? And how do we equitably share that value with consumers? So not every consumer is going to want to orchestrate their own participation in these markets. So how do we help with that? And how do we make sure that they're getting a slice of that? So that we now start to turn what is always been a liability. Vehicles historically have been the worst use of capital because they sit idle 95% of the time and they depreciate rapidly, right? So from a historical perspective, vehicles have been a terrible use of where to park your money. We're trying to think about EVs, given all these other value pools. How do we provide access to them, and how do we start to get that vehicle to a break even, and potentially even to an actual asset point where it is actually a revenue generator? And we're not talking all of the Star Trek stuff about vehicle autonomy and things like that. That is coming, but when exactly that's going to manifest, I don't know. I mean, it could be 10 years, could be 20. I don't know. But those other value pools are going to appear very, very soon, and they're already appearing in some markets. So one of the things that we're really, really focused on is how do we help create those markets if they don't exist already? How do we access them? And then how do we equitably share the value from them with the vehicle owner? And I think that's a very different mindset. We see almost everyone that's participating in the EV landscape is treating them largely just as a piece of mobility, as just a different version of the vehicle that we drive every day, or the petrol or diesel vehicle, and that's not the case. So I think that's the most fascinating part to me, and how these vehicles can help not just access all these value pools and potentially drive down the total cost of ownership for vehicles, but also help in the broader transition for sustainability. There's some really interesting research that's out that says when we hit 30% of EVs in the marketplace, across the totality of the Australian marketplace, we would have more than sufficient storage, assuming that all of them are vehicle to grid enabled, and more than sufficient storage to be able to run a nearly 100% renewable grid. That's fascinating to me, right? And that's a value pool that should be shared among everyone, including the asset owner. So I think if I think about what we're doing that is probably the most interesting and disruptive, it's that space.
Yeah, that sounds really positive, and also kind of takes sustainability to kind of a new level. And the idea of a vehicle being an asset, I think, is a really interesting concept, and one that I haven't heard before. I think a lot of this discussion is making me rethink my 2006 Corolla, but we'll think about what else is out there. But I think tying this all with a financial wellness perspective, so sustainability, we've touched on that. But Joel, I'd love to know a bit more about what you're thinking with increasing the access of vehicles for everyday Australians. So thinking about, we spoke about that younger generation who, thinking about perhaps their first car or what they can afford. And I think there's been some good conversation about, making that entry-level vehicle, electric vehicle, more affordable, so that, when someone's looking for their first car, there is that sort of small car that is, mid-price that they can afford, rather than seeking out a used petrol car. But what are you thinking in terms of increasing the access of these kinds of vehicles, and I suppose the flow-on benefit that this sets up for this cohort?
Yeah, look, it probably reiterates a lot of what we've heard today, but the first step is we want to know when our customers in the car buying journey, and we want to talk to them early about the benefits of an EV, and help them understand the full end-to-end financial picture versus just the short-term sticker price that we spoke about. From there, we want to give them a good loan product to finance the EV, and that's a cheaper rate. And what that means is that there's a lower repayment, and they can start to offset some of the higher costs that might be associated on the sticker price of the EV, but the lower repayment on the finance helps to kind of make the week-to-week budget work. And then third, we want to introduce them to the lowest cost, best deal on an electric vehicle. We've recently became the preferred finance provider for Tesla Australia. So we're available at the Tesla checkout. Tesla's a great product, probably in the sort of upper market of the price point. We would love to expand that to other manufacturers that want to offer CommBank customers a good deal on an EV. So for us, that's then the third step there is, how do we connect our customers with a good deal, and actually start to partner with those that are interested in providing low-cost electric vehicles to the Australian consumer. And we think as the biggest bank that we have a role in making and facilitating that connection for our customers.
Yeah, CBA certainly has a unique opportunity, I think, particularly with your younger customer base as well. I think it's exciting to think about that opportunity that you have, even just with messaging, even getting some of these messages we've discussed across to quite a vast customer base, I think could be quite impactful. So lots to think about there. And I'm conscious of time, so I think perhaps it could be good if we end the discussion today with some concluding comments from each of you around what you're looking forward to. Or I think we've had quite a lot of positive discussion around the opportunity and what you feel could happen, even not 20 years away, but 3 years, 5 years, even 2 years. We were discussing some reasonably soon time periods, but I'd love to know if there's anything in particular that you're looking forward to, even in the next 12 months, or any kind of anything you're feeling particularly optimistic about, I suppose, could be a good way to end this discussion. Joel, did you want to start with any thoughts there?
Yeah, sure. I'm looking forward to everyday Australians embracing EVs. It's, as we've spoken about, it's gone from sort of being this premium product to every day. I want to see more EVs parked in the shopping centre, car parks. My family that live in other states and in regional Australia are starting to talk to me about the next car being an EV and what the consideration that needs to be. And so it's coming from I'm in Sydney at the moment. It's going from being an inner city Sydney to a potentially regional Western Australia, Wollongong, where I've got family. They're actually starting to think about EVs as the next car. And so, for me, I'm looking forward to going to see my friends and family in other places and seeing more and more EVs on the road.
Yeah, I'd say, we're every time surprised by just how quickly things change. And we saw this with things like rooftop solar panels. So I've been doing this work for now sort of the last 7 or 8 years. And I always tell the story that in those early days, every 12 months, we would look back and see that the market, people buying electric vehicles, the industry, the sector, all of it looks completely transformed over a 12-month period Now we do that once every 3 months. Things look completely different and things are growing at such a fast rate. So for me, it's really looking forward to in 12 months' time being able to look at something that is completely unrecognizable from how it looks today.
And I think for me, I'm looking forward to a flood of new makes and models coming into the marketplace. There's heaps and heaps that are coming. That's really exciting to me. I think I'm looking forward to the end of the infrastructure conversation. So at some point we will solve the charge dilemma. And as I like to say, we don't have an infrastructure problem. We have a charge velocity problem. There's electricity everywhere. What we have is the ability to transmit it from one entity into a vehicle or anything else. But we're building on that every single day. That to me is, I look forward to the end of that conversation. And I think it's coming, and it's coming a lot faster than people think. I know a lot of the conversations I've had where people challenge me on their longest drive and they say there's no EV charging, and use your Google Maps, search a long route, EV charging. Look, there's 30 stations along the way, right? And they're just not as prevalent as your normal petrol station. So I think those are the two things that I'm really looking forward to, that preponderance of new vehicles entering the marketplace, new selection, and hopefully the end of the infrastructure conversation at some point.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that all sounds really positive, and I'm certainly going to rethink my car, as I mentioned, and think about what the options are. But Vinita, I'll hand to you for some final comments.
That's great. Thank you so much to all three of you. It's been so enlightening. I mean, it isn't often that, there's something I learn which is completely new to me. So I am so pleased that we picked this really different view on financial inclusion and had your experience here. And like Anna, I have a 19-year-old who's going to buy his new car. So I really hope that by next year, when he's saved up enough to have a small deposit and then the bank of mum and dad or CBA, Joel, you never know, come to his rescue, that it can be a really sustainable electric vehicle. And I love the fact that you want to turn a liability into an asset. That's always what a good banker wants to hear. So thank you so much to all three of you. We've had a wonderful, really enlightening conversation, and I'd love to reconnect maybe next year, Anna, in Financial Week in 2024 to see how far the market has transformed. So thanks again for your time. It was wonderful to talk to you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.